Before the accident, Tomiwa and Mofe had what many considered a perfect life. They lived in a beautiful, sprawling mansion in the heart of Lagos, surrounded by the lavish comforts that came with Tomiwa's successful business ventures. He was a well-known millionaire, a man respected by everyone who knew him. Mofe, his wife, was the epitome of grace and warmth. She had a nurturing spirit, and her devotion to her family was unmatched. Together they had created a picture-perfect life, with their only daughter, Fola, being the center of their world. Mofe was more than just a mother and wife. She was the heart of their home. Her days were filled with caring for her family, maintaining their home, and ensuring that everything ran smoothly. She was loved and admired by everyone around her, and her bond with Tomiwa seemed unbreakable. Tomiwa was a busy man, often traveling for work or meetings, but when he was home, his attention was always on his family. He cherished Mofe, and they had an unspoken understanding that they were in this life together, partners for better or worse. But everything changed on one fateful evening when Mofe was involved in a car accident. It happened so suddenly. One moment she was in the car with a friend, and the next she was lying in a hospital bed, her world forever altered. The accident left her with a permanent disability. Her lower body was paralyzed, and she would need a wheelchair for the rest of her life. The news devastated her, but the emotional toll on Tomiwa was far worse. This was not the woman he had married. She wasn't the vibrant, active partner he had known, and in his frustration, Tomiwa's patience began to wear thin. At first he tried to put on a brave face, supporting Mofe as best as he could, but as the days turned into weeks and then into months, his attitude started to change. Tomiwa was a man used to being in control. He had always been able to fix things, whether it was business problems, financial struggles, or family matters. But Mofe's condition was something he couldn't control, and that drove him to resentment. His patience began to dwindle, and the kindness that had once been a part of him slowly faded away. The transformation in Tomiwa was almost imperceptible at first. He was still outwardly kind to Mofe in front of others, but behind closed doors, the cracks in their relationship began to show. He started blaming her for things that were out of her control, for inconveniencing him, for holding him back. He began to treat her with coldness, and his words became sharp and cutting. Mofe, who had once been the pillar of their household, now found herself isolated, both physically and emotionally. It wasn't that Tomiwa didn't love Mofe anymore. He still cared for her in his own way, but the resentment he felt for the situation, his loss of the woman he had once known, the change in their lifestyle, became overwhelming. His heart, once full of love and affection for Mofe, now seemed consumed by frustration. He found himself avoiding her, unable to face the reality of their new life. Mofe, on the other hand, couldn't understand what had happened to the man she had married. She had always been supportive of him, always put the family first, and now she was the one who needed support. She thought that their love would carry them through this challenging time, but Tomiwa's behavior made her question everything. She struggled to come to terms with her own limitations, but it was Tomiwa's rejection that hurt the most. Instead of helping her heal, he seemed to grow further and further apart from her. At first, Mofe tried to push through her pain, focusing on her family and the hope that things would eventually get better. She relied on her daughter Fola for emotional support, even though she knew that Fola was also struggling with the changes. Fola was caught in a difficult situation, trying to understand the dynamics between her parents while also dealing with her own emotions. She had always seen her parents as a united front, and now she found herself in the middle of a growing conflict she couldn't fully comprehend. Tomiwa, however, had no such reservations. He did not attempt to disguise his growing frustration. He began to lash out at Mofe for things she could not change. Every task she struggled with, he would criticize her for. The once loving husband who would help her with anything now seemed to treat her like a burden. The house, once filled with warmth, now felt cold and uninviting. The tension between them was palpable, and Fola could feel it with every passing day. Despite the increasing strain in their marriage, Mofe kept her feelings to herself. She didn't want to add more pressure to an already tense situation. She continued to care for Tomiwa and Fola, still doing what she could to keep the family together. But inside, she was breaking. The woman who had once been the backbone of the family now felt invisible. Her injury had taken so much from her, but it was Tomiwa's treatment of her that felt like the greatest loss. One night, as Tomiwa returned home late from a business trip, Mofe was waiting for him in their living room. She had been trying to practice walking with her walker, pushing herself a little further each day. It was painful, but she was determined to regain her independence. When Tomiwa entered, he barely acknowledged her. He walked past her without so much as a greeting, and the silence between them was deafening. Mofe sat there watching him, her heart heavy with sadness. She knew things weren't going to be the same, but she had never imagined that the man she had spent so many years with would grow so distant, so cold. She thought back to the days when they would talk about their dreams, their future together. Now those dreams felt like a distant memory. Tomiwa's resentment grew as he became more consumed with his business and less interested in their family life. He started spending long hours away from home, even on weekends. When he was home, he would retreat to his office or simply watch TV, avoiding interaction with Mofe. Mofe, now dealing with both the physical pain of her condition and the emotional pain of her husband's neglect, began to question whether their love had been as strong as she had believed. This was not the life she had imagined. She had hoped that, despite the challenges, their love would see them through. But Tomiwa's indifference made it impossible to hold on to that hope. Every day she felt herself slipping further away from him. And so as the months passed, the love that had once been their foundation began to erode. Mofe was left to deal with the harsh reality of her situation alone, both physically and emotionally. She had become the person she had never thought she would be, dependent, isolated, and unloved by the one person she had always trusted to care for her. The months following Mofe's accident saw a gradual but significant breakdown in the marriage between her and Tomiwa. The once warm, loving relationship was now strained to its breaking point. Mofe had always been the heart of their home, the woman who held everything together with grace and kindness. Now she was facing the painful reality that the man she had loved for so long had begun to change in ways she never could have anticipated. Tomiwa's frustration was evident in everything he did. He began to resent the responsibilities that came with caring for Mofe. He no longer wanted to spend time with her. Gone were the days when he would offer comforting words or help her with tasks. Instead, his responses to her requests for help were met with anger or indifference. He was a man used to control, and this new reality was one that he could not seem to accept. At first, Mofe tried to understand. She told herself that it was difficult for Tomiwa as well. After all, their lives had changed overnight, and both of them had to adapt to this new reality. But the more she tried to reach out to him, the more distant he became. He would criticize her for the smallest things, things she had no control over. Whether it was the house not being clean to his liking or her inability to do things she once did, nothing she did seemed good enough for him. Mo felt as if she was walking on eggshells in her own home. She had always prided herself on being an efficient and loving wife, but now, no matter how hard she tried, Tomiwa's anger and resentment felt like an insurmountable wall between them. Each day she would wait for him to come home from work, hoping that today would be different. Maybe today he would show some sign of the man she once knew, but each day her hopes were dashed, and the coldness of their relationship only deepened. Tomiwa would often come home late, disappearing into his study without acknowledging Mofe. She would watch him, her heart heavy with sadness. She could feel him withdrawing from her, and it was as though he no longer saw her as his wife but as someone who had become a burden to him. In the past, Tomiwa had been affectionate and caring. He had showered her with love and attention, often bringing her little gifts or planning thoughtful surprises. But now, all of that had vanished, leaving behind a man who seemed to only feel resentment and frustration. Fola, their daughter, noticed the changes as well. She had always been close to her parents, but the rift between them was now impossible to ignore. She would come home from school and find her mother sitting alone in the living room, waiting for Tomiwa to return. She could hear the coldness in their interactions, the way Tomiwa would speak to Mofe with barely disguised irritation. Fola, who was once the light of their family, now felt like a bystander in her own home. She longed for things to return to how they once were, but deep down, she knew it was no longer possible. As time went on, Fola became more and more disillusioned with her father. She had always looked up to him, admired his strength and success, but now she began to question the man he had become. He had always been the one to provide for the family, the one who made decisions and gave direction, but now it seemed as though he had lost his way, consumed by his own selfish desires and frustrations. Fola couldn't understand how the man who had once been so loving could turn into someone so unrecognizable. One evening, after another tense dinner where Tomiwa barely acknowledged his wife, Fola found herself alone with her mother in the kitchen. Mofe was sitting at the table, her hands folded in her lap, staring blankly at the counter. The silence between them was thick, heavy with unspoken words. Fola could see the exhaustion in her mother's eyes, and it pained her to know that Mofe was holding everything together, while Tomiwa was absent both emotionally and physically. "Mom," Fola said gently, breaking the silence. "Are you okay?" Mofe looked up, her eyes softening when she saw her daughter. She forced a smile, but it was clear that it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm fine, Fola. I'm just tired." Fola didn't believe her. She knew that her mother was trying to be strong for her, but she could see the cracks beneath the surface. "I don't know why he's acting like this. Why does he treat you like that?" she asked, frustration evident in her voice. Mofe shook her head. He's struggling too. This isn't easy for him either." Fola wasn't convinced. "But he's not even trying. I've never seen him like this before. He's not even the same person." Mofe sighed deeply. She had tried to protect her daughter from the truth, but it was becoming harder and harder to keep up the facade. "I don't know what's happening, Fola. He's angry, and I don't know how to fix it." The conversation left Fola feeling even more conflicted. She wanted to protect her mother, to take away the pain that was so clearly affecting her, but she didn't know how. She was only a teenager, and the weight of her parents' problems was too much for her to carry on her own. Meanwhile, Tomiwa continued to retreat further into himself. His business had grown more demanding, and he used work as an excuse to avoid facing the reality of his home life. He would spend long hours at the office, often coming home late, and when he was home, he would retreat to his study, leaving Mofe to deal with everything on her own. One day, Mofe decided to try something different. She had been reading about ways to adjust to her new life in a wheelchair, hoping to regain some semblance of independence. She had heard that physical therapy could help her regain some strength, and so she decided to give it a try. Namdi, the physical therapist she had been referred to, was kind and encouraging, and his gentle approach made a huge difference in her emotional state. Slowly but surely, Mofe began to make progress, learning to move in ways she had never imagined possible. However, as Mofe made strides in her physical recovery, Tomiwa's coldness became even more pronounced. He no longer even made an effort to pretend that things were okay. He avoided any discussions about her therapy or her progress, and instead, he spent more time with his work, his friends, and his business ventures. Mofe began to realize that Tomiwa had stopped seeing her as his partner. To him, she was now just a reminder of his own inability to fix their broken reality. He had retreated into his own world, abandoning her to navigate her pain alone. Mofe's heart ached, but she refused to give up on herself. She was determined to make the most of her recovery, to prove to herself that she was still capable of living a full life, even if Tomiwa couldn't see it. As the weeks turned into months, Mofe's physical progress continued, but her emotional pain deepened. The weight of Tomiwa's neglect began to feel unbearable. And it was during this time that Fola began to notice something else: her father's increasing absences and strange behavior. It wasn't long before Fola's suspicions began to grow. Tomiwa's coldness had not only been aimed at Mofe, but also at their daughter. It was almost as if he was shutting out everyone in his life. Fola started to ask herself questions she had never thought to ask before. What was really going on with her father? And what was he hiding? It was during a weekend that Fola's suspicions finally reached their breaking point. For weeks she had noticed the subtle changes in her father's behavior, his increasing absences, his dismissive attitude toward her and her mother, and the oddities that seemed to be piling up. At first she had tried to ignore the nagging feeling that something was wrong, but now she could no longer turn a blind eye. The turning point came one afternoon when Fola came home early from a study group. She had spent the entire morning buried in her books, trying to focus on her exams, but as she stepped through the door, something felt off. The house was quieter than usual. There was no sound of her father's booming voice or her mother's comforting presence. Fola found her mother sitting alone in the living room, staring out of the window. Mofe looked as though she hadn't moved for hours, her face drawn with exhaustion. Fola's heart sank. She knew that her mother was trying her best to cope with the changes in her life, but the weight of Tomiwa's absence, both physical and emotional, was starting to take its toll. "Mom, where's Dad?" Fola asked, though she already suspected the answer. Mofe glanced up, a faint smile touching her lips, though it didn't reach her eyes. "He's at work," she said, though Fola could tell from the tone in her voice that Mofe didn't believe it herself. Fola nodded, though her mind was racing. She couldn't ignore the fact that her father had been spending more and more time away from home lately. When he was there, he was distant and aloof, hardly engaging with anyone, especially Mofe. It wasn't like him, but Fola couldn't quite pinpoint what was bothering her. As she left the living room and made her way upstairs to her room, Fola's mind continued to race. She tried to concentrate on her homework, but her thoughts kept drifting back to her father. The more she thought about it, the more the pieces began to fit together, and the more unsettling the picture became. She remembered overhearing a conversation between her mother and a family friend a few weeks ago. Something about Tomiwa working late, a business meeting that had kept him away longer than expected. Fola felt a surge of frustration building inside her. She had always trusted her father, looked up to him as a role model, but now something felt wrong. Her mind kept returning to one thing. Why had he been acting so distant? Why had he been spending so much time away from home? Was there something he wasn't telling her? That afternoon, as the sun began to set, Fola's curiosity got the better of her. She decided to follow her father. At first it felt wrong, as if she were betraying him somehow, but the need for answers was overwhelming. If her suspicions were true, she needed to know the truth. She waited until Tomiwa left the house later that evening. He was dressed in his usual suit, looking the part of the successful businessman, but Fola knew this wasn't just another business meeting. She followed him discreetly from a distance, her heart racing with each passing minute. After a short drive, she saw Tomiwa pull into the parking lot of a high-end restaurant. Fola's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't seen her father go to a restaurant in the evening in weeks, certainly not alone. She couldn't understand what was happening, but the unease in her chest only deepened. She parked her car a few spaces away, just out of view, and waited. She didn't know how long she'd have to stay, but she had to find out what he was doing there. As she sat in the car, trying to calm her racing thoughts, she saw a familiar figure walk into the restaurant, Chinonso, her best friend. Fola's breath caught in her throat. What was Chinonso doing there? Why was she meeting Tomiwa? The two of them had never been close, but Fola had trusted her, had considered her almost like a sister. Now the sight of her entering the restaurant with Tomiwa sent shockwaves through her. Fola's mind was in turmoil. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. Her father, the man she had looked up to her entire life, was meeting with her best friend, and it wasn't just a casual encounter. The look in their eyes, the way they spoke to one another. It was clear that something more than business was happening. The realization hit Fola like a tidal wave. Her father wasn't just emotionally distant, he was having an affair. The man who had always prided himself on his family, who had taught her the importance of loyalty and trust, had betrayed her mother in the worst way possible. And the worst part, he had betrayed her trust as well. Fola didn't know what to do. She sat in her car for what felt like hours, the weight of the truth sinking in. She wanted to confront her father, to demand an explanation, but something inside her told her that it wouldn't change anything. Tomiwa had made his choice, and now Fola had to come to terms with it. As the night wore on, she watched Tomiwa and Chinonso leave the restaurant together, laughing and talking as if nothing had happened. The sight of them together was enough to shatter Fola's sense of security in her family. She had always thought her parents' love was unbreakable, that their bond would withstand any challenge, but now she realized that love had been a fragile thing. It had been built on a foundation of trust that her father had willingly destroyed. Fola returned home that night, her mind numb with disbelief. She knew that she had to tell her mother, but the words felt impossible to say. How could she break her mother's heart? How could she tell her that the man she had loved for so many years had betrayed her so completely? When she walked into the house, the atmosphere was different. It was quiet, too quiet. Her mother was sitting in the living room, looking even more withdrawn than usual. Fola could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the same exhaustion that had been building up over the past few months. It was clear that Mofe had been struggling, but now Fola knew just how deep the pain ran. "Mom," Fola said, her voice barely above a whisper, I need to talk to you." Mofe looked up, offering a tired smile. "What is it, Fola?" For a long moment, Fola didn't speak. She didn't know how to start, how to explain what she had seen. But in the end, she knew that her mother had to know the truth. With a deep breath, Fola gathered the courage to say the words that would change everything. "I saw Dad tonight, Mom. I saw him with Chinonso. They were together, in a restaurant. And I think they're having an affair." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Mofe's face drained of color as the truth began to sink in. She didn't say anything at first, but the hurt in her eyes was enough to break Fola's heart. The truth had hit Mofe like a slap in the face. Fola's words echoed in her mind, repeating over and over, "I saw Dad tonight, Mom. I saw him with Chinonso. They were together, in a restaurant. And I think they're having an affair." The realization was unbearable. Tomiwa, the man she had spent decades with, the man she had loved and trusted, had betrayed her in the worst way possible. Mauve sat still, her heart heavy with grief, unable to process the devastation that had just been revealed. The hurt was too much to bear. She had known deep down that something was wrong, but she had never imagined this. She had always believed in the strength of their love, in the unbreakable bond they shared. Now that belief was shattered beyond repair. Fola, though heartbroken herself, tried to comfort her mother. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I know this is hard, but you deserve to know the truth. You can't keep living like this. You deserve better." But Mofe remained silent, her mind racing. Her body felt heavy, as if the weight of the betrayal was too much for her to carry. She had been through so much already. Her injury, the struggle to regain her independence, and now this. Her marriage, which had once been her safe haven, had been torn apart, and she didn't know where to turn. For the next few days, Mofe withdrew even further into herself. She stopped going to therapy for a while, unable to find the energy to face her recovery when the very foundation of her life had crumbled. Fola tried to encourage her mother to continue with her sessions, but Mofe was consumed by the pain of her broken marriage. She didn't want to get better, not if it meant facing a future without Tomiwa by her side. Tomiwa, on the other hand, was blissfully unaware of the impact his betrayal had on Mofe until it was too late. He continued his affair with Chinonso in secret, all the while going about his business as usual. He didn't even realize the emotional devastation he had caused until one evening, when he returned home after a long day at the office to find Mofe sitting quietly in their living room, staring at the floor, her eyes empty of the usual warmth and love. He could sense the change in the air as soon as he walked in. The house was still, too still. There was no greeting, no acknowledgement of his presence, just an oppressive silence. He had grown used to the silence between them, but this was different. It was colder, deeper, and it cut through him in a way he hadn't anticipated. "Mofe," he said, his voice faltering for the first time in months. "Why aren't you in bed? You should be resting. You've been pushing yourself too hard." But Mofe didn't respond. She didn't even look at him. Instead, she turned her gaze toward the window as if lost in a world of her own. Tomiwa, caught off guard by her behavior, stepped closer. "Mofe?" he repeated, his voice softer now. Still, there was no response. Tomiwa took a deep breath, his frustration mounting. He was already tired of dealing with the strain in their relationship. He had hoped that things would improve on their own, that the pain of her injury would eventually fade. But now it was clear that the problems in their marriage were much deeper than he had realized. "Are you going to keep ignoring me like this?" Tomiwa snapped, his anger bubbling to the surface. "You can't expect me to keep pretending like everything is fine. I'm doing my best here, Mofe." Finally, Mofe turned her head to look at him, her eyes cold and full of disappointment. The words she had been holding back for so long finally escaped her lips. "I know about Chinonso," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the torrent of emotions raging inside her. "I know about your affair." Tomiwa froze. The blood drained from his face. He had hoped, foolishly, that his secret would remain hidden. But there it was, the truth out in the open, and he couldn't deny it any longer. "Mofe, I didn't mean for you to find out like this," he began, but his words were hollow, weak. "I've been struggling. I'm not perfect. I don't know how to fix things, but I'm sorry." Mofe stood up slowly, her expression unreadable. She had heard his apology, but it meant nothing to her. How could it? How could she believe anything he said now when his actions had already shown her the depth of his betrayal? "I don't want your apology, Tomiwa," she said firmly. "You've broken my heart, and nothing you say can fix that. You made a choice. You chose her over me, over our family, and I can't ignore that." The words stung, but Mofe wasn't done. She had been quiet for too long, too patient with a man who no longer deserved her patience. "You say you've been struggling," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "I've been struggling too. I've been fighting every day just to survive, just to regain some part of my independence. And through it all, you've ignored me. You've belittled me. You've made me feel like I'm nothing." Tomiwa stood there, unable to respond. The anger in Mofe's voice, the hurt in her eyes, it cut through him like a knife. For the first time in months, he felt small, ashamed of the man he had become. He had taken Mofe for granted, assuming she would always be there no matter how badly he treated her. Now that reality was slipping through his fingers. Mofe, however, had reached a turning point. She had spent so many years putting others first, her husband, her daughter, their family, but now she was finally seeing that she had neglected herself in the process. She had to stop waiting for Tomiwa to change. She had to take control of her own life, for herself and for Fola. "I can't keep living like this, Tomiwa," Mofe said, her voice quieter now but firm. "I need to focus on myself, on healing, and I can't do that while living in a house full of lies and betrayal." For the first time, Tomiwa realized how far he had pushed her. She wasn't asking for his forgiveness, nor did she need it. Mofe had made her choice. She was going to heal emotionally and physically, with or without him. "I'm done, Tomiwa," Mofe added, the finality of her words sinking in. "It's over." Tomiwa stood there, frozen, unable to process what had just happened. The woman he had taken for granted, the woman he had hurt, was walking away from him. He could see it in her eyes. She was done. She had given him all the chances she could. There would be no more waiting for him to change. Mofe walked past him, heading for the stairs, leaving him standing in the hallway, alone for the first time in years. The days following Mofe's decision to end her marriage were filled with a strange mix of emotions. On one hand, she felt a sense of liberation, a weight lifting from her shoulders as she finally took control of her life. On the other hand, the pain of Tomiwa's betrayal still lingered. The heartache was deep, but Mofe knew it was necessary for her to walk away, for herself and for Fola. Tomiwa had not left the house immediately after Mofe's declaration. He had been stunned, caught completely off guard by her strength. He had always believed that no matter how badly he treated her, she would never leave him. But now, in the cold silence of the house, He realized that Mofe had found a way to move on without him. It was the hardest pill he had ever had to swallow. For the first time in months, Tomiwa tried to approach Mofe. He sought her out in the quiet moments when Fola was not around to speak with her. But each time, Mofe remained distant, her heart hardened by the years of neglect and pain. He had come to her once in the living room, the place that used to be filled with laughter and warmth, but now felt hollow. Tomiwa, looking defeated, had stood in front of Mofe, his hands shaking slightly. He had tried to apologize again, but the words came out wrong, too late and without sincerity. "I'm sorry, Mofe. I know I messed up," he began, his voice faltering. "I can't undo the hurt I've caused, but I'm willing to do anything to fix things. Please, just give me another chance. I know I failed you, but I swear I'll change." Mofe, who had once been the forgiving, patient wife, didn't flinch. She had heard those words before, too many times. She had hoped for so long that Tomiwa would wake up, that he would see the woman he had hurt, the woman he had abandoned, and realize that she was still the same person he had once loved. But now she knew better. She knew that some things couldn't be fixed with empty promises. Her gaze was steady, her voice calm but firm. "I don't need you to change, Tomiwa. I don't need you to fix anything. What I need is for you to understand that I can't continue living this way. I've spent so many years making excuses for you, for your behavior, but I'm done. I've worked too hard to get to where I am now to let you pull me back into that toxic place." The pain in her voice was palpable, but there was also a strength there that Tomiwa hadn't seen before. This was not the woman he had known, a woman who had once silently endured his mistakes. This was a woman who had found her own power, who was ready to walk away regardless of the cost. "I loved you, Tomiwa," she continued, her voice trembling slightly with the weight of her own emotions. "But I've loved myself enough to let you go. I can't keep living in the shadow of your lies. I won't. I owe it to myself to heal, to rebuild my life. I can't keep waiting for you to change. I've waited long enough." Tomiwa felt a lump form in his throat. The woman before him, the woman he had taken for granted, had finally reached the point where she was no longer willing to settle for his broken promises. It hit him harder than anything else, harder than the guilt, harder than the anger. The realization that he had lost her forever left him speechless. Mofe stood up then, walking past him as if he were a ghost. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She had made her decision and there was no going back. Fola, who had been silently watching from the doorway, stepped into the room, her face a mixture of confusion and relief. She had heard the conversation between her parents, and though it had broken her heart, a part of her knew that this was the only way forward. Her mother was finally standing up for herself, finally taking control of her own life. It was a painful, bittersweet realization, but Fola knew that it was for the best. "Mom," Fola whispered, walking over to Mofe. "Are you okay?" Mofe smiled weakly, her eyes tired but full of determination. "I will be, Fola. I'm going to be okay." The journey ahead was not going to be easy. Mofe still had much healing to do, both physically and emotionally. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace. She had taken the first step toward rebuilding her life. She had made the difficult decision to let go of the man who had once been her everything and to focus on herself. She had made the decision to heal. As the days passed, Mofe returned to her physical therapy. It wasn't easy, but with each step she took, both literally and metaphorically, she grew stronger. Namdi, her physical therapist, had always been encouraging, but now, with Tomiwa out of the picture, Mofe felt a new sense of purpose. She was no longer just recovering for her family, she was recovering for herself. Fola too began to open up more, slowly rebuilding her trust in her mother and in herself. The bond between mother and daughter, once fractured by the pain of the betrayal, began to strengthen. They supported each other through the tough times, knowing that, together, they could face anything. Tomiwa, meanwhile, was left to reflect on the choices he had made. The man who had once been so proud of his success, who had built an empire, now found himself alone. He had lost his wife, his family, and his own sense of worth. He knew he could never undo the damage he had caused, but it was too late for regrets. The damage was done, and the consequences of his actions had cost him everything. Moph, however, refused to look back. She had learned the hard way that the most important person to take care of was herself. She was no longer the woman who would silently endure. She was strong, independent, and capable of standing on her own 2 feet. She had reclaimed her life, and with it, her dignity. In time, Moph learned to walk again, not just physically, but emotionally. She was finally free, and as she stood tall, she knew that her future was her own to shape. The road ahead was still uncertain, but one thing was for sure. She was going to walk it with strength, resilience, and the unwavering knowledge that she deserved better.